My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and welcome to the virtual reading group today. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's last somewhat unfinished book, The Life of the Mind. The first part of the book is called Thinking, and that is what we are making our way through at this point. We're in part 3 of Thinking, which is called Why We Think, or What Makes Us Think. I'm sorry, What Makes Us Think. We started this section last week, and we said that she talks about two different answers to the question, what makes us think? The Greek answer, which is a desire for immortality. We think because we want to make make the world and make ourselves last. We need spectators to perfect and correct the world of appearance. The poets, the blind poets, the bards, they encounter the world, and they seek to say something, a poem, a work that raise us to the immortal, and that this was the pre-philosophical reason for why we think. She says that for Plato, as a later instantiation, we think out of wonder at the world, but we think out of wonder at the world in sense of trying to unify it and make it eternal. And this is distinct from the pre-philosophic Greeks. In a sense, we think in order to reconcile or make the world rational, to make it whole. And this, as we talked about last week, which gets picked up by Hegel and Marx later on, is for Arendt a very dangerous drive of thinking, which is to insist that what is real, the world, become rational, and thus impose upon it a kind of rational or totalitarian requirement or standard, an unwillingness to accept and address the messiness and sloppiness of the world, and that was and so Plato's attempt to think was too much out of unity and too much out of an attempt to bring rational unity to the world. The Roman answer, which is what we begin with today in section 16 of the book, which she says is largely our common opinion today, is that we think because out of a sense of Weltfremdheit, a sort of stepping back from the world, a lack of engagement with the world. The Romans originally, she says, and the early Romans and the early Roman Republic were deeply political people, worldly people. But by the late Republic, when Roman philosophy is taking over and sort of standardizing Greek philosophy, the mantra is admire nothing. Don't be surprised at anything. Stand aloof, stand back. We should say that to some degree, Arendt has been criticized for this at times. For example, in her reading of Eichmann, where she, tries to take Eichmann seriously, and she's been criticized by people for her sort of her ironic distance. And in this group, there have been conversations we've had where we've talked about to what extent we should engage fully in the world, and to what extent we engage as a thinker, as someone who seeks to understand it and make sense of it almost from an outsider perspective. And Arendt often called herself a pariah, right? A conscious pariah, someone who stood on the outside looking in. And she thought there was a place for that in the world, for that kind of thinking. Not completely, right? Even in the outsider status, as she tries to think and understand totalitarianism, she wants to destroy it. And she thinks that to destroy it, though, requires also understanding it. And it's that complexity in her thought. On the one hand, an active engagement, and on the other hand, a real profound belief that in order to act in the world, it's first necessary to think and understand. This is also how she often criticizes the activists of the 1960s, who she engages with many times. And she says, they were inspiring. She was inspired by their activity and their engagement and their joy at politics. And that part of the activism she found meaningful and inspiring. We need people out in the streets. We need people singing songs together. We need people protesting and put their bodies on the line, right? She that was for her important. But she says that the reason they didn't succeed is because they hadn't thought enough about what they were doing. They hadn't yet, they were still using old and tired slogans from 100 years ago, from Marx or from other people. And they weren't trying to create they didn't have an idea of how to create a common sense, a new common sense, a new alliances with people that would allow their revolutionary fervor to actually become powerful, to have a majority of people, or at least a very large minority of people. This is, by the way, a similar argument to someone like Bayard Rustin makes in his article Protest and Politics, From Protest to Politics, which is a very Arendtian article in which he argues that protest is important. You need protest, but at some point you need to also make alliances and figure out what your revolutionary program is that will actually bring the people along with it. And so to some degree, Arendt believes that thinking is, even though it's sometimes unworldly and outside, is a necessary part of political action. And so for the Romans, she says, they're too often not even involved in that at all. They're just thinking outside from this idea of the painful disunity of the world, and they seek to create a unity, but it's a unity that's so abstract and so caught up in the self and based in an impulse to escape the unbearable world that it brackets out reality. And as she says, reality cannot touch it. And this is the sort of origin of Stoicism and Stoic thinking. And for her, this sort of the Stoic focus on the self, and then I have to take care of the self and protect the self and not get myself dirty, is a betrayal of thinking. She has this, I don't know how many of you caught the reference to the Phalarian bull on page 157. It's something she uses a number of times. It's a great image. The Phalarian bull is a big bull that they would burn people alive in. And she says, the Roman thinkers who believed in themselves, it's nice, but if they're being cooked in the bill, they're not in the bull and being burned alive, they're not going to remain a master of their own self, right? This kind of Stoic, just ignore your body and be a thinker, she doesn't think much of. And so, this is her critique of Roman thinking, which begins in this sort of desire to protect the self and hold on to the self, and an escape from the world. So if the Greeks started in immortality, which was actually a worldly idea, that we wanted to beautify the world, to improve the world, make the world just, make the world worthy of lasting, and that was the original Greek spur to thinking. The Platonic move, which is to say, well, we actually want to reconcile the world with thinking, begins to move us away from the world, because we now get caught up in the ideas instead of the world. And then the Romans move us further away from the world. I'm going to give this chapter a little bit of short shrift, just because it's one of the, it's a chapter in which he's saying this is one of the wrong paths of thinking. Chapters 17 and 18 on Socrates are two of the more extraordinary chapters in Arendt's corpus, and I think deserve our attention. So she says, okay, well, what makes us think, right? Not just immortality, not sort of reconciliation, and not a protection of the self. But how do we think about thinking? How do we think what makes us think? The thinkers, the professional thinkers, she says, don't tell us very much about it. They sort of think, but they don't tell you why they think. And so she says, we have to turn to a model. And the model she offers is Socrates, someone who is not a professional thinker, who wrote nothing down, and who would have been maybe forgotten if it weren't for Plato and a few others, but mainly Plato, who wrote about him. And so she creates Socrates as a kind of ideal type of thinker. And as she works through this ideal type, there are a few steps, right? So the first step is that Socrates is someone who asks questions about things like justice and courage. What is justice? What is courage? And we call these things in philosophy concepts. Happiness. What are these things? They're not things you never see courage, right? Or you can see courageous actions, but what is courage? What is happiness? And she says these concepts are like frozen thoughts. So the example she gives is one we use in first year philosophy courses: a house. What is a house, right? I mean, a dwelling. Okay, who lives in it? How big does it have to be? Does it have to have a kitchen in it or a toilet? What makes it a dwelling? Is a lean-to a house? Is an igloo a house? How do we think this thing called a house? And what she says is that when we think about the word house, we realize and we unfreeze it out of its meaning. We don't get anywhere. We're never going to arrive. Thinking will never lead to a definition of what a house is. It's entirely without results, right? This is all on page 171. And so, and yet the thinking does something. It makes us think, well, is an apartment a house? Is a lean-to a house? Is a cave a house? And we begin asking these questions. And, it's not that we come to an answer, but we begin to, think about what a house is. And what does that matter, right? Why? Well, first of all, why do we think? What makes us think? And why does it matter? Good questions. And what she says is that Socrates doesn't say we think because it will make us better. It's not going to make us more moral. It's not going to make us better. So why do we think? What makes us think? She pursues this first through the three metaphors that Socrates, or similes, I'm sorry, that Socrates uses to describe himself. On the one hand, he's a gadfly. As a gadfly, he's constantly buzzing around disturbing the undisturbed, um, pushing them to think, and to arousing them to think and to examine who they are. Like, buzzing around telling you, think, what is a house? What is justice? What is courage? And that kind of annoying questioner that Socrates was, who constantly sits at your dinner table and says, well, have you thought about this? Why do you say that? And everyone's like, oh my God. But that's the first sort of simile that Socrates uses to describe himself. He infects people with perplexity. The second is that he's a midwife. And insofar as a midwife, he doesn't have the answers or have the thoughts. His job is to help you to see or know what you already know, to deliver your thoughts to you, and to help you see whether your thoughts are real, a real child, or a wind egg, just that you were a falsely pregnant of some sort, and purge people of their wind egg opinions and help them to deliver real children. So help you to figure out what your thinking is. That's the midwifery aspect. And then the third is that he calls himself a stingray or an electric eel or an electric ray, however you want to call it. And you constantly paralyze, but the paralysis is the opposite in a sense. What it rouses. The gadfly rouses. The paralysis stops you, and makes you stop and think. And even though you're paralyzed, he says you feel like you're most alive because you're thinking. You're alive in the sense that your whole body and your existence is engaged. And these three together, the gadfly, the stingray, and the midwife, for Arendt, show that Socrates is someone for whom thinking is an activity. It is the wind of thinking. It's the storm of thought. It's the entire experience of being paralyzed into thinking, being aroused into questioning, being a midwife into delivering other people's thoughts. It's the attempt to upset all standard accounts, the attempt and the activity of putting into question anything that's taken for granted, that's common sense. And thus thinking is deeply destructive. It is dangerous to all settled opinions. Thinking itself is dangerous, right? There are no dangerous thoughts, Arendt writes. Thinking itself is dangerous. She writes that here. She writes it again in Thinking and Moral Considerations. It's obviously a line that means a lot to her. It's, we've used it in the Arendt Center a lot. I think it's at the very core of what it means to be someone who reads Hannah Arendt, to think in this way, to be dangerous insofar as you think, to have no shibboleths, to have nothing that you won't question. And then this wind of thinking, there is a danger, another danger that emerges, which is two: nihilism and cynicism. Thinking can lead to nihilism. It can lead to saying, well, nothing is true. There are no higher truths. Anything that we believe, we can tear down. We can show it to be just another creed or opinion. And cynicism is to just disbelieve and question and see the hypocritical nature of all creeds and opinions. And Arendt is very clear that this is a danger of thinking. It's a byproduct of thinking. It's what thinking can lead to when it is done. Well, we have to ask, does all thinking do this? Is all thinking nihilistic? Arendt doesn't think so. Is all thinking cynical? Again, she doesn't think so. But But why and how is an important question. She says on 177 that non-thinking, which might seem recommendable given that thinking is so destructive and leads to nihilism, also has its perils, right? I mean, yet it's a very strange way for someone like Arendt to put this. I mean, you think she's always going to be rah-rah, go-go thinking. I don't think that's right. She sees thinking as deeply important. But, throughout her work, as early as her book, Rahel van Hagen, and we've talked about this earlier, thinking can be dangerous. It can lead you outside the world. This whole premise of the last 100 pages that we've read is that thinking withdraws from the world. It pulls you away from the world. And that's dangerous. And here, thinking is destructive of all creeds and all opinions. It's thus destructive of all common worlds. That's dangerous. And so, but non-thinking has its perils as well. By shielding people from the dangers of examination, it teaches them to hold fast to whatever the prescribed rules of conduct may be at a given time in a given society. It's not that non-thinking says you should believe this prejudice or this creed or that opinion. What non-thinking says is you should believe opinions. You should believe creeds. And it teaches you and it habituates you to any code. It could be the Christian code, could be the Jewish code, it could be the Muslim code, but it also could be the Hitler code or the Jim Crow code. And non-thinking thus really does make it so that people can be switched over to almost like a switch, she thinks, to any code that is in power at the time. And so we need thinking because the perils of non-thinking are extreme. And yet we need to be aware that thinking, the wind of thought, which sweeps away all established signs, creeds, opinions, this is on 178, which rouses you from sleep, is dangerous. And so that raises the question of how can we, on the one hand, why do we think? For her, not for any moral reason. I mean, I think that's an important point. Again, we're going to come back to the evil question in a second, but we think because we're alive. We think because in thinking, she says on 178, to think and be fully alive are the same. And this implies that thinking must always begin afresh. It is an activity that accompanies living and is concerned with such concepts as justice, happiness, virtue, offered us by language itself as expressing the meaning of whatever happens in life and occurs to us while we were alive. It's this. And so here, what we've done, I hope at this point in paragraph 17 or chapter 17, shown that for her, thinking is an activity. It's a need for Socrates. It's not, as for the ancient Greeks, simply about immortalizing, about taking the world and making the world good and making it beautiful. It's not for Plato, as in reconciling the rationality in the world. It's not for the Romans in sort of withdrawing into the self. Thinking is being alive. Thinking is being human. And yet then the question emerges of, well, why is thinking important? And we go back to the question that began the whole book on thinking, which is it possible that in some way thinking is what can inoculate us against doing evil? And this leads to the last chapter of this section, the 2-in-1. Again, the point here is that that thinking is an activity in itself that we do because we love thinking, not because of its objects, not because of the good or the beautiful. Yes, there's an eros to thinking, a love of wisdom or justice, and here what Arendt says is, people will love different things. And we can't risk the fact that some people will love evil, and some people will love this, some people will love money. It's not true that everyone wants to do good. It's a dangerous conclusion, and it's not even true for the best people. And so to think that we will be protected from evil because in thinking we'll end up at the good, she thinks is a fallacy. So what is thinking, and how might it inoculate us against evil? She says there's only two positive things that Socrates says about thinking, both from the Gorgias, Plato's Gorgias. One is that it's better to suffer wrongs than to do wrongs. And two, that it's better to be out of tune with others and with the world than with yourself. These two famous claims of Socrates in the Gorgias. And Arendt says that it's the second, the need to be not out of tune with yourself, that is actually the foundation of the first. And this leads her to a long inquiry through Plato's Sophist and Heidegger's essay, Identity and Difference, where through a long, Heidegger, through a interpretation of Plato's Sophist, that Arendt was actually a student in that class when Heidegger taught this class on the Sophist, I think in 1928 in Freiburg, claims that the key to reading it is that is the use of the dative in the sentence in the Greek, which leads you to say that I am this not the same to myself. I am myself to myself, and thus that there is an identity and difference. We'll leave that to the side for now. I'm just going to mute everybody. Hold on. Can you hear me now? Can you guys hear me? Yeah. And Arendt says, I'm going to leave Heidegger and Plato to the side. I think they're wrong on this. It's taking it out of context. But what she says is that the essence of thought that Socrates discovers is not that there's an identity in difference, but that I am a two in one, that the two in one, that I speak to myself, that I am always in conversation with myself when I think. That for nothing can be itself and at the same time for itself, but the two in one that Socrates discovered as the essence of thought. And that in this two in one, which I encounter in solitude, right? Not loneliness, but when I'm in solitude, and thus begin thinking, and in thinking, talk to myself. And what this shows me is that I am essentially a plural being. I am not someone who has one side and one side only. I think, and that means I talk. And if I talk to somebody. And it is this duality of myself with myself that she thinks makes thinking a true activity, in which I'm the one who both questions and answers, or speaks and answers. She mentions the word dialectical and critical here. This is on 185, but she doesn't use dialectical in the sense, in the philosophical sense of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or conclusion. She uses it in the sort of sense of dialegein, of a talking through. I talk through with myself, and I ask myself, do I really believe that? Do I mean what I say? And that the criterion of this two in one, this mental dialogue, is no longer truth. She says, but am I consistent with myself? Am I who I am? can I say, um, I, that I want to kill, along with Richard, kill and yet be a good person? Can I do that? Or do I have to in some way live with myself at the end, and I don't want to live with myself as a murderer? Um, so thinking is not, you don't think something about something. It's a dialogue. It's this brute fact of this difference in my two and one, in my who I am. And insofar as I think I'm not an animal, which for Arendt is someone who, or something that is simply has one, doesn't have that silent dialogue in them, nor am I a God, because God has only his identity. It is man that is caught in between being a God and a thing, and is constantly at war with himself, arguing with himself, negotiating with himself, giving rules and disobeying those rules, putting his morality against his sensibility or his what he wants. And so man, she says, is neither a god nor an animal. And as the metaphor bridges the gap, as we've talked about, between the world of appearances and the mental activities in our mind, the metaphor is what connects us. So the Socratic two and one heals the solitariness of thought. It's what keeps us both solitary and yet in the world, because we're always talking with each other, and it actualizes this difference. There's a quick aside to Kant here on the categorical imperative. Very briefly, if you remember your Kant and your categorical imperative, it's that I must act as if I'm a rational being. I must submit my sensible side to my rational side. I must make my rational side, who I am on this side, my rational side, a king over my sensible side, or I must submit my sensible side to my rational side. I must be a law to myself. I must give the law to myself. And in the end, Kant says what that means is I must be a friend to myself. I must free myself to be who I am. And this friendship is the essence of thinking for Hannah Arendt. It's to be a friend to yourself, is to speak to yourself in such a way that you hold yourself to yourself. A friend is not someone who lets another do whatever they want and say, I'll love you anyway. A friend is someone who says, you need to be who you are and remember who you are. And so thinking thus creates this friend who I am, this other who keeps me to myself, keeps me honest. And thus it sets up what she calls conscience, or a daemon, the being that we leave at home, that we come back to when we're alone and we have to live with, that sets up obstacles to what we're doing. How is this have anything to do with evil? Well, what she says is there's a side effect of this. Thinking itself is not moral. Thinking itself has nothing to do with morality. It's about being who you are. And yet, in certain boundary situations in which there are what she calls political emergencies, where you are, in a sense, required by the world to do things that go against your conscience, go against your daemon, go against who you are. In those boundary situations, thinking stops you. It's a gadfly, it's a midwife, it's a stingray, it paralyzes you. And it makes you stop and think and ask yourself, can I do that? And simply by stopping and refusing to join in and thinking, when everyone else is swept away unthinkingly, as she says on 192, in such emergencies, it turns out that the purging component of thinking, right? The midwifery is political by implication. It makes you stop and think. It makes you say, can I do this? Can I go along with this? And in those situations, when you stop, others may say, oh, maybe I should stop. Or I see you stopping, Socrates, maybe I should stop and think. And by your example, I begin to question the sway that people are being swept up in a movement of some sort. And it's that way. That's a, she calls that a byproduct of thinking. It's not the why we think, but it's a byproduct of thinking itself that can prevent people unthinkingly going about doing evil, as she saw someone like Eichmann doing. And then there's a second byproduct of thinking, she says, which is that once you stop and think, you have to judge. And so judging, she says, is a second byproduct of thinking, that by forcing, by trying to judge particulars, brings us back to the world, and thus is another bridge between the world and our mental activities. And it's this, these two byproducts of thinking that make us stop and think and resist being swept away, and then make us judge, that she thinks are some of those rare moments that can prevent catastrophes, at least for the self. And so that's how these 3 chapters end, and section 3 ends on why we think. I'll stop there and take your questions or comments. As usual, there's different ways to make questions or comments. You can raise your hand through the hand raise function on the reaction button on the bottom of your page. Click on reactions and click raise hand. There's also an active chat, which I see is already very active. Please treat everyone with understanding and engage in thoughtful discussions. All right. Let's see. We've got a bunch of people on here. Clara, you're first.
Okay, thank you, Professor Roger. I would like to go to page 192, please. Mm-hmm. And then to the last sentence in paragraph 2, if possible, Professor Roger.
And such reflections will inevitably arise.
Here it says 192 with this edition, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's page 192, and then it's in paragraph, by the end of the paragraph 2, it says, here the point is.
Yeah.
I would like to go deeper in that reflection. Thank you, Professor Roger.
Oh, you just want me? So this is the paragraph that we were just talking about. Where Arendt says thinking itself is not moral. It's what makes us think for Socrates is simply the activity of life. But there's a moral byproduct sometimes. So for the thinker himself, this moral side effect is a marginal affair, right? But that it can become political in boundary situations. And then she has this paragraph on Karl Jaspers and his use of the word boundary situations, which are those which I cannot live without struggling and suffering. I cannot avoid guilt, that I must die. Clearly, the thought here is people who have to decide, do they go along with the Nazis, or they go along with, whatever movement is in power, or do they put their life on the line? Do they put their bodies in front of the tanks? Do they sit down in Tiananmen Square? Do they march, in Montgomery or in Birmingham? I mean, in Selma, all these places, these are places where you put your life on the line, and these are the boundary situations. And she says here, the point is, this is what you asked me to read, is that whenever I transcend the limits of my own lifespan and begin to reflect on this past, judging it, and this future, forming projects of the will, thinking ceases to be a politically marginal activity. And such reflections will inevitably arise in political emergencies. It's in political emergencies, in these times where when I think about my past or the past, or I think about the future, I can't separate myself, right, from and who I am, right, the being consistent, the being one, from taking some sort of a stand on these on political questions. Who I am, my very existence gets caught up in politics, and I can't escape it. And it's at those moments that I have to decide who I am. Am I someone who joins the Nazis? Am I someone who stands by and watches? Am I someone who goes into inner migration like Karl Jaspers? Or am I someone who fights and resists? The first two for Arendt are unthinking, or unthinkingly go along with. The last two, inner migration or active resistance, are acts of thinking. They're different. She doesn't. She credits both. Let's just say that she credits both active resistance and thoughtful opposition. She thinks that some people are actors, and when they think, they should resist by acting, by fighting. And she thinks some people are thinkers, and when they realize there's something like this is wrong, is going on, they can think. But even the thinkers, by thinking, are a model and an example for people, and show to people that there is an other way, and that makes other people stop and think and become an example. And so that's what I think is going on in those sentences.
Okay,
Dina.
thank you.
Yeah, Dina.
Is it possible that thinking is not only dangerous to the world, but doesn't occur in the world at all? In the human condition, Arendt says that everything that is must appear. And in this volume, she repeats that idea. At the start of the book, everything that is meant to be perceived by somebody. Not man, but men inhabit this planet. Plurality is the law of the earth. And yet in the chapter 17, she says that the trouble is that the thinking ego has no urge to appear in the world of appearances. It is a slippery fellow, impossible to grasp. So there seems to be a bit of a tension here. On the one hand, everything has the urge to appear, except the thinking ego. And so part of her project, she says, is to sort of tease the thinking ego out of hiding, to bring it into manifestation. And she ends the chapter with the idea that the wind of thought is manifested when we tell the difference between right and wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's all right. The whole sort of problem that she's grappling with in this book on thinking is that on the one hand, thinking is to her an authentic semblance. It's something that's, even though it may not, whatever the thinking ego is, we don't know what it is, but it means something. She thinks it's meaningful, and yet it's nowhere. It's invisible. It withdraws. And so this whole book on thinking on one level is about that. It's about how we do credit and make sense of the importance of thinking when it doesn't appear, or just generally does not appear. And part of the answer is that thinking is important in itself. Thinking is important as an activity. But there's another answer, which you're pointing towards, Dina, which is that there are times when, moments when, occasions when thinking does manifest itself and does appear. And they are not, they are what she calls byproducts of thinking. They're not thinking itself. Thinking itself, she's pretty clear about, you never see. I think she's pretty clear about that. And it doesn't appear in the world, and it's pretty useless. But one byproduct of it is that it helps create conscience. And in creating conscience, it can create, it can make us stop and think in ways that manifest themselves in the world. Because when we stop and don't do things, that becomes apparent. The thinking itself isn't seen. It's our stopping. It's our looking at people who do things or our questioning them. But it makes the underlying thinking apparent.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the reasons it's so hard to visualize or embody thinking.
And don't you think that the sort of one word for this byproduct of thinking that she will develop is judging?
Yes, well, that's the second part. And she's, unfortunately, she doesn't write the whole book on judging, but there are hints of where it's going throughout this book. And one is at the very end of the 2-in-1 on page 192 to 193, where you were just talking about. And yes, she calls judgment another byproduct of thinking. Because when we think, we then stop and think. It sort of forces the question. She says on the bottom of 192 that when we think, we destroy, right? And this destruction has a liberating effect on another faculty, the faculty of judgment, which one may call with some reason the most political of man's mental abilities. And this faculty, liberated by thinking, then has to judge particulars. We have to say, the police are wrong to be doing these things. And when we do that, and we make statements like this is wrong or this is beautiful, we then reconnect with the world, right? And judgment is a bridge back to the world in thinking. That is a byproduct of thinking. And so she says the manifestation, and you're right to put on the word manifest, what makes manifest, what makes it appear of the wind of thought, which is invisible. With the manifestation of it is not knowledge. It is the ability to tell right from wrong, beautiful from ugly. It is judgment. And it's in judgment that thinking becomes manifest, because it in making judgments about this is wrong, we underline that there must be a thought. And so we make the thought manifest, even though you can't see the thought. Jeff.
Yeah, actually, this is probably going to pick up from where Dina left us. I had a question. I had a premeditated question, and it had something that occurred to me while you were presenting. So I'm going to try and come about in here. Well, the premeditated.
Sí, Agustín, ¿tú a mí me oyes? Sí.
Let's mute everyone. Mute yourself.
Mira, a mí no me.
All right, go ahead, Jeff. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah. So the premeditated one was the same section, the same passage that Dina quoted there, which is just odd. Is after 3 chapters of reading, about the history of how thought has been treated by the ancients, then just I'm going to change the question. so I don't know, in my dialogue group, sometimes it comes up, it's hard to keep up with all of this, especially if you don't have the philosophical references. But to me, the articles feel kind of separate. I mean, they are individual thoughts, and then you wake up and we start another spot. And so this really sort of fit that for me, because I don't know. They basically that you really could start at 17 or even 18. They all sort of sit separately. So I just wondered if you had a position on that generally. But then, despite that, I think now I see a big connection between the let's say 17 and 18, where basically where she's describing Socrates through the three metaphors. And the gadfly is very familiar, and forgot what the first one was, but the one about the electric ray, that did sort of throw me for a loop. But then when you were explaining it, I was reminded of Jonathan Rottenberg. I don't know if that's like about 7 years ago. His book was called The Depths: The Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic. So, and this theory is actually very simple, which is just that the reason you don't do anything when you're in a depression is that the things that you would do would be bad for you. So your body, not knowing how to prevent you from doing a particular thing, just makes you listless, right? You basically, so that sounds a lot like the paralysis of the electric eel here, really. So you're thinking like, oh my God, I don't know. But your body says, he's thinking, oh, that's dangerous. Let's just it's basically they're going to sleep, right? You want to sleep all the time. So I thought that was a really nice fit to that. And then of course in 18, where she basically addresses the Eichmann type concern so well, then that sort of comes into play there. So I don't know. So that part's not premeditated. I'm just trying to figure out how that fits together. Although you're talking about judgment, and here's another bit of a theory here.
Yeah.
Which is just that maybe judgments are really just the last thought we had before we acted again. Because once you act, then thinking goes away. That's been the view through this. So
Okay.
those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, on that last point, I mean, the connection between will, judgment, and then action, is the judgment still, and I mean, she still wants to say that even judgment is invisible, but it's, as a mental activity, but it's then actualized or manifested in our actions. But even if it's invisible, insofar as it is a judgment about particulars in the world, it reconnects us to the world. But I thought I'd try and take a stab at your first question, or your premeditated or unpremeditated, whichever one it was, about the structure of this book, this chapter, because I think it's a good question, and I think it goes to Arendt, and I don't have a perfect answer to it, so it's more interesting. Why does she write chapters 14, 15, and 16? Clearly she wants to get to Socrates and talk about thinking in the way, we are. She wants to talk about thinking as an activity separated from morality, an activity separated from the world, and yet one that affirms plurality, and in the end has, in certain situations, can manifest itself in conscience and also in judgment. So what are the first three sections for, besides showing off? I think there's a number of answers to that. One is, she really is struggling with and trying to show the way professional philosophers, the pitfalls of professional philosophy, and the way that they get caught up in this thinking practice as a profession that separates them from the world, that imprisons them in the self, that comes to hate the world in a certain way, as she thinks not Plato himself per se, but the Platonic tradition and the post-Roman tradition both do. And so it's not just, it's there for a reason. She wants to show, again, the perils of philosophizing and the way that so many professional thinkers have gone astray on these questions. And then turning back to Socrates as a model who's not a professional philosopher, but a thinker, someone who didn't write down, didn't have a theory, and his whole premise was that he knew nothing. And so, there's probably more to be said about it than that, but at least that's one answer to your question, Jeff. Okay. The judgment stuff we'll keep coming back to. I think I've already talked a bit about it, but we'll keep coming back to it. All right, Susan.
So I've been struggling with the whole 2-in-1 concept, and I thought at one point today you said that she described it as being at war with oneself, and it's been going through my mind that the thinking mind is battling with the willing part of the mind. So that's where the battle comes in. And in the Kantian concept, I thought was really speaking to that you mentioned earlier, that the rational being is subsuming the sense being. And so that's how you create the friend or the harmony that I think she talks about with Socrates, and not being out of sync with yourself. So I'm wondering if you can clarify what's going on with the 2-in-1.
Great. I use the word, I don't know if I use the word war or not, but I don't think it's wrong. In the chapter that we'll come to a little later on Kafka's Parable, which actually we're coming to it very soon, the gap between past and future, which is also discussed in the preface or prologue to Between Past and Future. She says that thinking is what exists in this battlefield between past and future. And I do think the battlefield metaphor is helpful for her. When you read the quotation from Richard III, which she offers on page 189, which is something she, again, uses in a number of different essays. Richard's at war with himself, right? What do I fear? Myself. There's none else by. Richard loves Richard, yet that is, I am I. There is a murderer here. No, yes, I am. Then fly. What, from myself? Great reason why. Lest I revenge what? Myself upon myself? Alack, I love myself. Wherefore? Right? He's at war with himself. He's struggling. That's thinking. That's coming home to your conscience. When I say friend, Kant argues that the categorical imperative, which is that I must act such that the maximum of my actions accord with my rational will, rational self, I must make the subjective, sensible parts, what I feel, what I want, accord with my rational. I have to then give myself, my rational self, to myself as a law. And then the final presentation of it is I must be a friend to myself. I must learn to free myself to be myself. Who is myself? Well, I'm on the one hand plural. On the other hand, in order to be myself, I have to be consistent with myself. Now, why? I mean, Emerson, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. I don't think Arendt or Kant disagrees with that, but they do think that that to be who I am, I at least have to have a core. I have to have a sense of who I am, and to be a friend to myself means to free myself to be that and to be who I am. In a very difficult thing to do, to just talk to yourself and let yourself be who you are. So it can be a war, and thinking often is a battle, because these are very different parts of yourself. And yet, in the end, what she counsels is learning to be a friend to yourself. Okay. Bernie.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Bernie.
In many ways, it's kind of very similar to what Suzanne's question, and just maybe a little more clarification on page 184 when you were talking about the kind of the two-in-one, or the difference in identity. I mean, part of it is I'm trying to tease out the difference between duality and plurality.
That's a good question.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just, I'm kind of just trying to work through it, because in many ways, this conversation really relates a lot to, really read The Body in Pain, Elaine Scarry, and she talks about war and, the what happens in war, in the structure of war, is that you move from plurality then to duality, which is a us versus them, and then to singularity, which is one, the winner of war. So in many ways it kind of has that, ties in well to that. But in terms of when I think duality, I think, I kind of think of polarity and of the Cartesian split. So I'm just trying to see how she's kind of, linking the two, because on page 184, she says, I don't know where. So she's, I think, quoting Heidegger. What is different is always so called with reference to other things, but they're opposite things. They're opposites, things that are what they are in themselves, partaking the idea of difference insofar as they refer back to themselves. They are the same with or for themselves, so that each eidos is different from the rest, not by virtue of it's different, but because it partakes of a character of difference. That is not because it has a relation to something else from which it is different, but because it exists among a plurality of ideas. And every entity qua entity harbors the possibility of being looked upon as different from something. In our terms, wherever there is a plurality of living beings, of things, of ideas, there is difference, and this difference does not arise from the outside, but is inherent in every entity in the form of duality, from which comes unity as unification.
And then she says, this seems to me erroneous. Yeah.
Okay.
So why is that erroneous? Because it privileges unity. It basically is saying that the difference is just there to bring back a unity. And that identity includes difference, but in the end towards identity. I think for Arendt, there's this identity is something that really almost doesn't exist. Now, how do I say that? How can she say that at the same time as she says, well, I must be one, Socrates says, right? And we must be a friend to ourselves. Well, who is ourself? Who is Richard? You know, the answer, if there is one, is that there's what she calls an essential plurality. Man exists essentially in the plural. Now, why does she call it 2 in 1, not 3 in 1, or not many in one? It's a fair question, Bernie. I really do actually. I think it's a fair question. I think partly that it's thought on the relation of friendship. I could be wrong. I don't have proof for this, but I think she's thinking about plurality as friendship and identity as friendship, and that what the 2 in 1 and what solitude brings out is that we talk to ourselves. It's a dialogue, and maybe we have 5 voices. I don't know how many voices you have in your head. I have a few, but she calls it the 2 in 1, the fact that we talk to ourselves, but I think she means the many in one. She does say it is this duality of myself with myself that makes thinking a true activity, in which I am both the one who asks and the one who answers. But I don't think there's only one who answers. I think there's many who answer. Each one is a duality, but I think there's more to it than that.
So she allows the possibility of a third.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I can't cite for you. I don't know if she ever talks about it. Jerry, I think, is on. If he knows, he'll tell me. But I think that the 2 in 1 is thought on the nature of friendship, but it could also be called the many in one, I think. Although how many friends can one have?
Great. Thank you, Roger.
Yep. Denny.
Hi, Roger. Thank you so much for your presentation. I consider that you already answered my question, but I'm going to ask you, how can we distinguish when we are judging and when we are thinking? I don't wanna be bad at this question, because I think that, as you said, thinking sometimes pushes us apart from the world. And judgment is like, it helps us to stay in the world, to get back to the world. But I don't know if we can distinguish between judging and thinking. What do you think?
Well, it's one of those questions that people write books on in Arendt, because she didn't finish the book on judging, and so there's no Arendtian final answer, and so everyone has their answer. And I don't know if I have a better answer than anybody else. I think that they're not the same. I mean, even in what we just read today, thinking can get lost. It can get lost in flights of fancy. It can get lost in the self. It can get lost in dreams like Scipio or Scipio, however you're going to pronounce it. It can get lost in total fantasy. Judging can't, because judging always, now what brings thinking back to the world is metaphor and the connection to the world through language. Judging, by its very nature, judges things, judges the book. Is this a good book or not? Is this a beautiful pen or not? Is this a beautiful painting or not? Is this a moral action or not? And so judging has to come back to the world. And And that's a big difference between judging and thinking. They're both invisible. They both are withdrawn. They both, exist outside of not an appearance, and both are connected to the world, one through metaphor and one through particulars. But judging is more connected to the world, which is why it's the most political of the mental activities. I think that's what I'm prepared to say for now. Is that, I hope that helps.
Yes, it helps. Thank you.
Will.
Hi, Roger. Thank you. So my question is about sort of a confusion around Arendt's concept of thinking. I see sort of a duality or a tension in two concepts that she puts forth. First, like today we've talked a lot about how thinking can be very destructive. It unweaves the web that's built every morning. It's critical and it can be dangerous. But at the same time, in chapter 14, when she's talking about the pre-philosophic assumptions of Greek philosophy, she says that thinking does have this sort of unifying quality, or it does have like a positive moment when it arrives at a story or a meeting, and it puts together an otherwise imperfect world into a unified story about that world. So is she talking about the same thinking here? Is she talking about the thinking?
I'm guessing you're saying less about thinking and more about poetry, but where are you reading where she says this about thinking?
The particular passage is 133, is on page 133, the second paragraph. The meaning of what actually happens and appears while it is happening is revealed when it has disappeared. Remembrance, by which you make present to your mind what actually is absent and past, reveals the meaning in the form of a story. The man who does the revealing is not involved in the appearances. So there's this like thinking as remembrance, which is a unifying moment, it seems, as opposed to a destructive, critical one that challenges or sort of deconstructs. And I'm curious. Yeah, I'm sort of curious about that duplicity, and if what she's talking about here is the same thinking as she's talking about later.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think you might be talking about also the above that. She says, without spectators, the world would be imperfect. This is the top of 133, right? Mm-hmm. The participant, absorbed as he is in particular things and pressed by urgent business, cannot see how all particular things in the world and every particular deed in the realm of human affairs fit together and produce a harmony, right? That's what you were talking about before, which itself is not given to sense perception. And this invisible in the visible would remain forever unknown if there were no spectator to look out for it, admire it, straighten out the stories, and put them in words. So this is the pre-philosophical Greeks. And the premise of the pre-philosophical Greeks is that they tell stories. They fit the world into a story, produce a harmony, straighten the story and of course, in straightening it, do some violence to reality because reality is not straight. And in doing so, they set it right. These are poets, right? Now, these poets, on the one hand, are remembering something that's already happened and doing so in an invisible way, but then they make it visible in their story or in their poetry. So remembrance, by which you make present to your mind what actually is absent and past, reveals the meaning in the form of a story. So that's partly what thinking does. And for Plato, that's going to become sort of the crux of it, which is to then care about the meaning and the story more than reality. And in a sense, separate thinking from reality. And that's the beginning of the dangerous path away. But thinking for the pre-philosophic Greeks already, does straighten, does reduce it, but its point is to re-enter reality, to tell a story about reality that immortalizes the world and engages in the world and remakes the world. And so it's because it's still engaged with the world, it's much less it's much less dangerous than the Platonic or the Roman philosophical approach. If you're asking, is it contradictory to say that thinking engages in the world? No. The thinking itself is what the poet does, then they tell the story. The poet has to be blind, has to retreat, has to leave the world, think it, straighten it out, and then they speak it. The speaking is not thinking, that's poeticizing. This is her thinking about art, that the artist has to think free from the world. And then, but that's the artist as thinker. Then the artist creates. That's not thinking, that's doing, that's creating. I don't know if that helps or not. I'm not sure. Maybe you can state your problem again and see if I get it.
Yeah, so that is helpful. I think another maybe way to come at it is like Arendt is very insistent on the idea that thinking is generative of meaning, that we can arrive at meaningful conclusions through thinking, or at least there's some positive moment in the thinking process where meaning is posited. But we see time and time again that Socrates, he doesn't arrive at a positive moment. The whole conclusion to a Socratic dialogue is aporia, right? Is sort of hitting rock bottom, where a definition hasn't been reached, or a positive definition hasn't been reached, but a lot of them have been negated. So I see this like meaning generative thinking and this like deconstructive thinking, where the first one I think has to do with more with like telling stories and uniting the world as we see it in remembrance, like the pre-philosophic Greeks did, and then the second is more like Socrates. And I think that's the confusion. That's another way to put the confusion.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. In the discussion of Socrates, the focus is really on thinking as liberating and destructive of creeds. And I think you're right to point out that there's another side of thinking. Well, okay. The other side of thinking you're pointing out, which is the creative or the generative side of thinking, which is what's being talked more about in the pre-philosophic chapter. We might start to think connects more with judgment, with saying what is good and what is beautiful and what is right. I mean, the whole telling a story doesn't mean isn't a matter of thought. It's a matter of judgment. It's a matter of bringing your thoughts back to particulars and straightening the story out to make it better. That's a matter of judgment. And so to some degree, I hadn't thought about this before, and so probably I'm wrong, but maybe we'll see. The pre-philosophic assumptions of Greek philosophy you see thinking and judgment more in harmony or more together, and less split than you would in a Kantian or more analytic approach that she's talking about in 17 and 18.
That sounds right. I think that might be one way to sort of solve the dilemma. But I appreciate your insight. Thanks.
May I add something?
Yeah, who said that?
Dina.
Dina.
Yeah, just quickly on pages 168 and 169, Arendt actually distinguishes, right, of the Plato Socrates from the other Socrates, and in that discussion points out that what is striking about the Platonic Socrates is that those dialogues are aporetic, but that's not necessarily true for the other Socrates. And then on the next page, on 170, she'll clarify that the meaning producing, generating thinking that the question was referring to might not be one of taking a position, might not be one of positing, but rather be one of slipperiness in and of itself. So I would just refer to pages 168 to 170 as part of that sort of discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dina. I'll go and take a look.
Great, thanks, Dina. We're sort of getting close to time, so let me move on to Patrick. Patrick?
I was away for a second because of the internet connection problem. I would also want to go back to this on page 171, this quote that said that thinking is entirely without results, but it is there is a qualification to that. I'm not sure whether that's the right word. She says this reflection does not produce definitions, and in that sense it is entirely without results. My take of this whole thing, so she only talks about reflective thinking, and as I experience this, it is that I have and use always, and we all use preconceived concepts, which then the Socratic way of thinking, the reflective thinking, demands us or wants us to examine what they really mean. And we can use them very easily in a meaningful way in our everyday life. But then this reflective thinking, reflection means that we split it into a duality, that what we have appropriated as our preconceptions.
Patrick, hold on one sec. I'm going to mute everyone and then unmute yourself because there's something going, some sound in the background. So just unmute yourself.
So this reflective thinking, we have a split between this preconceived concept, which I myself have appropriated, and this questioning thinking ego, which asks and examines whether this preconception is really meaningful and is really the proper one. So this critical instance. So, and that's why I think it's really a duality, because it's like reflection is, you have two, and I wouldn't agree that this is entire.
I lost you. Patrick, I think you froze. Okay.
Receive what you do not achieve is.
Are you there, Patrick?
A final result, but it is only an approximation that brings you closer to something more meaningful and expands your horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and let me, I mean, you broke up a little bit, so I didn't know if I caught all of it, but let me say that the other, you said there was the qualification, which is that that this kind of reflection does not produce definitions, and in that sense is without results. But there's another qualification, which is that though somebody who had pondered the meaning of house might make his own house look better. And what that means is there are certain kinds of results to thinking. Not any known ones. And by the way, the line she follows this with, which is one of my favorite lines in Arendt these days, and I sort of left out of my original presentation, is that Socrates, at any rate, is commonly said to have believed in the teachability of virtue. And he seems indeed to have held that talking and thinking about piety, justice, and courage, and the rest were likely to make men more pious, more just, more courageous, despite the fact that neither definitions nor values were given to them in their future to direct their future conduct. In a couple of essays written late in her life, she puts this in her own voice, not in Socrates, where she says that talking about piety, justice, and courage are likely to make men more pious, just, and courageous. So in that sense, thinking, talking to yourself, as well as potentially with others, can have results. And I think that's an important qualification.
And to add to that, one manifestation then of this thinking activity, so the activity itself does not appear, but when I fix it, my results of thinking, that's a thought. And I can fix it then in language or in metaphor or in art. And these are can be manifestations of the result of the thinking process. But of course, they freeze it, what thinking later unfreezes again. Because as soon as I freeze it, it will turn into a preconceived concept or preconceived idea, and thinking again might undo it and might make something anew from it, which might look differently, or it might expand it even more. And then looking at what we can, as a spectator on history and the deeds of others, can be something that makes me think, also makes me reflect, because it might be the gadfly against my preconceived concepts, for example.
Thank you. So we're pretty much at time, and I see there's a couple more questions. I don't have a whole lot of time, but I don't know if Vivian or Stephen want to just ask a quick question, or if these are longer points.
I think I might ask mine next time.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, is that all right?
Yes, I would simply say that it's in thinking about the 2 and 1, it's helpful to look back at part 1 on page 37 when Arendt talks about character. The test of character is the Socratic be as you wish to appear, which means appear always as you wish to appear to others. So you're asking yourself, am I the person I want to be? Am I the character I want to be? And then when you talk about thinking as the many-in one, it's as if we're characters in a play surrounded by other characters, and we have to take them all into account to see if we are acting in the way that the play we're in requires.
Thank you. That's a great point and a good one to end on. We will continue with this next week. If you haven't yet and you still want to, I encourage you to register for the Arendt Center conference, which is going to happen on October 14th and 15th through the webinar. And look forward to seeing you next week and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you all very much.